Okay, because the last session that we discussed the story of the Akedah, which again on page 31, 32 in Sefer Ha-Aggadah. So we spoke about this the dialogue between Abraham and Yitzhak, the problematic concept of the Akedah in general, but on the other hand, the message that it was supposed to teach us that God is not interested in human sacrifices. So now we get to the point of the ram which is entangled in the thicket. So we have this interesting midrash. אותו העיל שנברא בין השמשות היה רץ ובא להתקרב תחת יצחק והיה סמאל עומד ומסטינו כדי לבטל קורבנו של אברהם אבינו ונאחז בשתי קרניו בין האילנות. So this is a much later midrash. We see the concepts that are here are not part of the mystical teachings. And the name also Rabbi is not a name that is mentioned anywhere in the midrash. So probably this is a 6th, 7th century midrash. And they say that the ram was trying to get closer to Abraham, and Satan, but here is called Samael, that some Kabbalists wouldn't even pronounce that name. You know, if you look at the Sidurim on Rosh Hashanah Kippur, it says, "V'risha kula be'ashan tichle, v'ta'avir memshelet zadon min haaretz." So they say, when you say the word Risha, techaven, have in mind Samael, and Zadon, have in mind Lilith. And those two words, Lilith and Samael, are not, the Kabbalists don't like to use. But they're not really Jewish names. They came into our language from other cultures, and were identified with the forces of evil. And here we have this Samael Omedu Mastino Kedei levatel korbano shel Avraham Avinu. The Satan was trying to stop the ram from getting into the reach of Abraham. So Abraham won't be able to bring the korban. Right? So if Abraham doesn't sacrifice his son and doesn't sacrifice the ram, it's a total failure. So it was what we call Ma'aseh Satan. It was the act of the devil that got the ram entangled in between the thicket. Now, there's a famous image of the ancient Near East. I'm sure you've seen it. It's a goat standing on it's a ram standing on its hind legs. Beautiful work of a blue and gold and silver and the horns are caught in the thicket. So it's an image that predates the Torah. So a lot of scholars said, "Okay, this here is the story of the Akedah. There is something that has a parallel in other mythologies." But like we explained before, the Torah uses images that people were familiar with and brought them into the whole context of the Torah. So if in ancient mythology, in the ancient Near East, this was a symbol of some kind of a sacrifice offer, to the gods, that may be justified, could have been that it was something that was presented when they did human sacrifices, the Torah used the same image of the goat or the ram in the thicket to say that we don't do human sacrifices. But besides that, we have this interesting concept that is, like I said, it's later to Judaism, of the dualism in religion. Judaism is a monotheistic religion. So only God is the only force, and everything stems from God, good and evil. But under the influence of Greek mythology, and then later on, early Christian sects, there was a push towards between paganism and monotheism, between the belief in many gods, that each one controls the sun, the moon, the tide, and etc., and one God. They became a sort of a new theology where there are two forces in the world, good and evil, and each one of them is independent. A lot of it also was the influence of the Persian Zoroastrian theology, which is still people practice in Iran. It's called Zardashti. But in Zoroastrianism, there are two main gods. Ahura Mazda is the god of good, and Ahriman is the god of evil. So there's always a constant fight between them. And it's sort of crept into Judaism for people to believe that Satan or Yetzer Hara or the devil or Samael or whatever it is has sort of an independent existence outside God, and he can do whatever he wants. And this is sort of reflects in the Midrash, where there's a struggle here between God and Satan to whether Abraham would succeed in bringing the Korban or not. And that's why I said this is sort of a foreign element. It's not part of our tradition. But it got into Judaism. So the way that it was mitigated by the rabbis, they replaced the word Satan by Yetzer Hara to say that it's not, don't blame the Satan, don't blame the devil. You know when people say the devil made me do it, right? I don't know what got into me. When you say I don't know what got into me, you're basically saying I'm not at fault. Something else, another force, took possession over me, and that's why I did what I did, right? Or I was, people say I was besides myself. Hachamim tried to change that. I mean, not this midrash, but in general, Hachamim were trying to say there's a concept called Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, which is natural and innate in us. And this is what, when we decide to do something wrong, we can't blame anyone but ourselves. It's something that when we say in Tfilat Rosh Hashanah, it has to do with that. Interestingly enough, according to one interpretation, it has to do with sheep. In Birkat Tfilat Musaf, we say Rosh Hashanah, Kol Ba'i Olam Ovrim Lefanav Kivnei Maron. Right? On Rosh Hashanah, we all pass it. It's taken from the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, Perik Aleph. It says, we all pass in front of Hashem like Bnei Maron. What is the meaning of the word Bnei Maron? So some say Malachim from the word Marom, like angels. And by another interpretation, it's like sheep, right? What? Like right. And also in Nuntane Tokef Kevakarat Ro'ai Idro, like a sheep, like a shepherd counting the sheep. The way for shepherds to count the sheep, especially when they had to do the Ma'aser, to separate the 10%, is that they would put all the sheep in one pan and pass them through a very narrow gate or hole to the other pen. So and they would mark each tenth with color. So only one sheep at a time could go through the hole. This is one interpretation of the word Kivnei Maron. Another interpretation is that it has to do with but less likely, that comes from the word Meron, a mountain in Israel where Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is buried. So Kivnei Meron say when you climb the mountain Meron, before the roads that we have today, there was a passage that only one person could go through at a time. You can't go side by side. You're alone on the mountain. And finally, one other interpretation, which actually is the most likely, is that it is a distortion of a Roman word. The original word was numeron, from the word number, numero. So which means numeron was the troop of soldiers. Each one of them is scrutinized by the commander personally. But all of these interpretations have the same idea. It's the idea of total responsibility. That when climbing that mountain is like the first solo flight. There's no one else to cover for you. You are on your own. The sheep that goes through the hole, at that moment it's alone. There's no one besides that sheep. Or Kivnu Meron, the soldiers, the idea of no soldier can blame or blend his blame into the troop. Each one of them is reviewed personally by the commander. The same idea comes to Rosh Hashanah. One cannot blame Yetzer Hara as an outside force. You cannot blame your parents, your friends, your children, your colleagues. Someone made me do it. No, it's your responsibility. That's the idea of Rosh Hashanah, that we come with total responsibility, and we acknowledge that we take responsibility for our actions. So this is what Hachamim try to teach when pushing aside this whole concept of the devil or Satan as an outside force or as an independent force. And they also incorporated it into the tefillah when we say in everyday Shaharit, Oseh Shalom, Yotzer Or Uvoreh Hoshech, Oseh Shalom Uvoreh Takol. Right? The idea is that God is the one who created light and darkness. Oseh Shalom, peace and everything, right? Now everything is not the exact opposite of peace. The original pasuk, it's a pasuk of Shaya, is Oseh Shalom uvoreh ra. God created peace and created evil, right? And it all comes from God. So, and obviously, when we have other pasukim in the Torah and the Tanakh that explain that, God created the possibility, the potential to do good and evil. But He's not the one who's doing good and evil. It's us. It's the actions of human beings. We decide how to go about it. So even in that moment, when we go back to the story of the Akedah, for Abraham now was told by God at one point, sacrifice your son. He was then told by an angel, even though the previous Midrash says that God did speak to him, according to the Pasuk, it was only the angel who spoke to him. Right? So he has a choice. At the end of the day, the way the story ended with Abraham, even though it was guided by God, was really his decision. Because he had a choice. He could have reasoned, okay, God told me to go and sacrifice my son. And I did everything and I'm ready for that. And now the angel tells me not to sacrifice my son. What is the right thing to do? Is it about the veracity of the prophecy? He knows 100% this is what he has to do, or he had a choice. So the way the pasuk describes Vayisa Avraham einav vayar v'hine ayil ahar nehaz b'sevar bekarnav. So some people suggested to correct the word ayil ahar to ayil ehad, because the reading is difficult. But it could mean that he looked at the ram, he sees the ram, and the ram gets stuck in the thicket, and he interpreted it as a sign that he has to sacrifice it. But that moment itself, when Vayisa Avraham einav, Avraham raised his eyes and saw the ram, also could be understood as up until this moment he was locked on his mission, he has to sacrifice his son, but in that last minute when he hears the other voice, so wait a second, there's a possibility, there's something else that I must do. So it goes all back to the idea of choice and responsibility. So I think this is not according to this midrash, but this is the story that Akedah conveys, that one, God is not interested in human sacrifices. Second, that we have a responsibility to do that. Now, the next midrash speaks about Sarah losing, not being able to withstand when she hears the news. She doesn't know that Yitzhak was not sacrificed, and lo ispik ligmor et hadavar ad sheyatza nishmata. So according to this midrash, the Satan went to Sarah and appeared in the form, in the image of Yitzhak, and she says, "How are you doing, my son?" So he said, my father was about to slaughter me, and before he even finished it, she died. That's this midrash. And I remember we mentioned that there are actually three alternate endings to the story. All come from German Jewish tradition, and they all have to do with the idea of not being able to accept the fact that the story ends without a human sacrifice. The Jews in Germany in medieval times glorified the idea of dying for God. This was the height of the spiritual experience. So how can you explain that? Like when let's say you argue with a Christian, and the Christian says Jesus died for God, sort of, right? And all the martyrs died for God. We had hundreds of people who died for God. And you, in your tradition, you have one person who was asked to do that and didn't die for God, right? So they had to reason with that. So there are three interpretations. One, like I said, that Sarah commits suicide as a sacrifice because she says, God did not accept a korban from me, a sacrifice. I'm going to offer myself as a substitute for my son. Another midrash, which that was the one that took root in Ashkenazi literature, is that Abraham did sacrifice his son. There is a whole line of midrashim and poems that deal with that, late midrashim and poems that say that Abraham slaughtered his son, and then he was revived. There's a piyut, I don't know if it's in the Mahzor, but it says Rad tal tehi alav v'nithaya Tifaso leshohato. So that after the dew of revival, of resuscitation, revived Yitzhak, Abraham said, what's going on? It didn't work, I have to slaughter him again. And then, Nahal Elohim hatafo. The angel said, don't let him kill his son. And their tears turned into a river, and they snatched Yitzhak away from Abraham. And then Abraham says, what is going on? What is happening? Like he's perplexed that he cannot perform. So according to this midrash, Abraham actually did the Shahidah. And then there is one where he argues, okay, let me just make a little cut to make a symbolic thing. Then much later, actually, in the 17th, 18th century, in Europe also we have another interesting interpretation. Again, trying to say that Abraham was willing to do it. And that is, it's on a commentary on the juxtaposition of the Pesukim. The Torah says that when Abraham, we have the story of the Akedah, and right after the Akedah, the Torah says, "Vayachar devarim ha'ele, vayugad Avraham lemor, hine yaleda milka gam hi banim lenachor achicha, et oz bechor." It's the whole list. That Avraham was told, your sister-in-law Milka gave birth to some children for Betuel, and her granddaughter is Rivka. Rivka is eventually going to marry Yitzhak. So the Midrash says, why are those two stories written next to each other? Why the juxtaposition? And the answer is that after the Akedah, Ya Avraham meharher belibo ve'omer ilu haya Yitzhak nishchat lo hayu li banim. Right? So he was thinking, I should marry off Yitzhak, because imagine if it would be had been slaughtered now, it would have no children. And how would be the nevuah of Yitzhak yikareh lechazara? How would it be fulfilled? But this midrash, Shem Ishmael says, takes it to the other direction. That Abraham felt regret. He said, if Yitzhak were already married and he already had children, then I would be able to continue on to go on with the plan of the Akedah and slaughter him. Like he says, he felt regret. He says, the only reason I wasn't able to fulfill God's commandment is because he had no children, and the promise of you will have Zerah from Yitzhak could not have been fulfilled. It's amazing how the environment influences people to think in that manner. So that's just to put the whole thing in perspective. So what do we have? We'll conclude with that. What do we have to have in mind when we read the story of the Akedah? Is really the story of, in my opinion, the story of that dilemma when you feel that your religious duty pulls you in one direction, and your emotional, personal sensitivities pull you in the other direction. So what is it that you have to do? Where do you tell yourself, this is, if I feel so strongly, like in that case, Abraham should have felt very strongly that he should not kill his son, then he should have go back to God and say, please explain this again, because this is probably not what you want. Or in other words, it's the Akedah teaches us not to do human sacrifice, but also to constantly have a dialogue with God and ask what is exactly that God wants from me and how I implement it on a daily basis.